If you're scared of changing it on a Monday morning in a regular sprint, I want to know what you are going to do on Saturday night when it breaks. In production, people behave like the three monkeys, I don't see, I don't hear, I don't speak. Decisions and very common technical architectural patterns have nothing to do with technical choices and a lot with other forces of the system. Our business decisions are not very reliable. No project is delivered on time. It's quite peculiar for a business.
Welcome to Software Testing Unleashed, the podcast for testers, test automation engineers, test managers, and developers who want to create great software. My name is Richie. I'm a software quality coach, keynote speaker, and author. My guest today is Vanessa Formicola. I met her at the OOP conference in Munich this year, and we talked about the 7 sins in software architecture and how to avoid them and make architecture a great base for our testing efforts. And now, enjoy the episode. Hello, Vanessa. Great to have you on the show here.
Hello, thank you for having me. Good morning.
Yeah, it's great. It's here at the OOP in Munich 2026, and you have your speech today, and now here at the podcast, the first one on this day. So I'm very, very happy that you accepted the invitation and are here now.
I'm really excited about it. Thank you.
Yeah, it was great when I read your abstract, and you wrote about the 7 sins in software architecture. I said, okay, then we have to talk about that.
That's very kind.
Let's go straight into it. What are the sins we are doing in software architecture these days?
That's a really good question, and I think people wonder this when they read the abstract. So I think I highlighted 7 architectural patterns that I've seen over and over in different companies, and I'm sure there are more. Then people might have encountered some more. I think the key point here is to identify what are the behaviors that bring to negative patterns that you see over and over in your organization. So if I want to take an example of one of the patterns, I usually talk about the kitchen sink. So for who English is not a first language, there's an idiom in English language that says everything but the kitchen sink. And that usually means you have a backpack or a bag and you've stuffed everything possibly you could think of except the kitchen sink. Yeah. And that means that usually you have a service in your company. Some companies call it utilities. Some companies would call it like the name of your, company. It's usually a library where you put in everything and anything that people might find useful. And this is a pattern that I've seen literally in every single company I've worked in. So usually this develops because people feel that there is a need to share this kind of information, but there are a lot of other forces that cause that kind of pattern. So let's talk about why that is a negative thing, and then we can talk a little bit about what are the forces that cause that, so you can understand the kind of patterns that I talk about. So this is a very small, it seems like a really small architectural piece. However, how frequent it is and how negatively it impacts the organization is important to try and understand these negative patterns that I would like people to reflect on. So when you have a service that is shared by all the services of your company and that nobody truly owns, and that usually what you will find is that there's heterogeneous kind of functionality. So team A starts thinking, I want to share this between 2 of my services, and that's okay. Then team B thinks, you know what, I could really use that. We should share that. And then it opens to 2 teams. Very quickly, it will move to be all the teams in the company. And while the first 2 teams maybe had kept track of what was duplicated, of testing, of what the other team had done, the 3rd, the 4th, the 10th team is not going to do that. And the more you grow in size and the less people will refactor it and know what's in there. So you will have a very big blast radius if something goes wrong. A lot of incentives to not refactor it because you will not have context of all those teams. And you will have more complexity, more bugs, everything negative that you wouldn't want in a service with shared ownership. So the question is, how does this happen? So why is this something which is simple but so common and happens so frequently? So in my opinion, there are many forces that influence our technical decisions that have nothing to do with technical choices. So you would ask the technologists what's best practice, and they will give you the right answer. But then what you see is that your software and your tech and your architecture have nothing to do with what people have talked about. Why is that? Because there are other forces in your system that influence people, because people write software in a direction or another. In this specific case, usually I have seen a couple of patterns of why this happens for forces external to tech. One is usually your career management, reward management system. It depends how you call it in your company. Is the set of your career framework, performance reviews, all the system that rewards and is meant to coach people. Usually there's an entry that says something like this. People are as senior as the scope of their impact. So maybe it's your team, maybe it's 2 teams, maybe it's N teams. What is an easiest way to prove impact than to add a little functionality in a service that is used by so many companies and be able to list that in your career performance review? Because when you have to be very careful about what you measure, because you get what you measure. So this is a human force of potentially a career system badly applied or people trying to game the system. But this is very common of how people try and prove impact further than their area by doing something that is counterproductive. Other examples of this are when you are under a lot of delivery pressure, let's say unreasonable delivery pressure, we all have delivery pressure, people will find a way to cut corners because they have to do their job, and I can't blame them for that. So if you already have a delivery mechanism, instead of integrating with another team, you just share the functionality in the place that you already have a connection there. And this is another example of how decisions and very common technical architectural patterns have nothing to do with technical choices and a lot with other forces of the system. So I go through in my talk about all these seven different patterns. This is just one of them. But what you will find if people maybe listen to some of my other talks, and this will be re-recorded, or maybe others will be recorded, that you can find through my social media and articles, you will see that there's different forces, and some are the same, that create many, many patterns. If you want, I can mention a few more patterns.
Yes, sure, please, go on. It's very interesting.
Yeah. So another pattern, and this is more on how your code presents, I call the Cirque de Soleil coding. And for who's not familiar with the performers, Cirque de Soleil is a group of acrobatic performers which are famous for their really sophisticated and quite complex acrobatics. And that's the entire point of the show. They're fabulous. What happens is that when you open a code base, let's say you're new to a company or you're just opening a new service, and you see that even for very small features, people have stuffed in every single possible design pattern, every single detail of every library, and all the possible newest library that just came out. That to me is an example of Cirque du Soleil coding. So what's negative about this? What's negative about this is that you paid more of what you needed for the feature, and you are definitely paid more to maintain it. Yeah. But the thing that worries me the most about this is the culture of coolness over the culture of simplicity, which I consider the culture of professionality. So when you work in a system and you feel that you have to prove yourself this way, and that is the direction, you have to look at your culture to understand. So what are, in my opinion, the other forces that influence this? Because we always talk about simplicity as a value as technologists, right? Yeah. But why do we end up rewarding people for doing that? Usually in my experience, it happens for multiple reasons. So one reason is, again, your career framework. There's usually an entry that says, that person masters breadth of skills and technologies, and people need to prove it. And this is because sometimes engineering managers might not go through 6 months of PRs to say that person has shown over a period of time that they can apply those skills. Usually you need a link to a PR or something like that to prove that that person does. So people will optimize for their review. Be careful about what you measure, especially with human beings, not only on your system. Another element is when somebody who is considered a good role model, so it's been rewarded, is known to be somebody to listen to, has an inclination of that sort, for whatever reason, you're already shaping the culture in that direction. It might be that you, as a maybe senior leader, have rewarded somebody in that specific circumstances, but you have to be careful, because when that becomes the role model, everybody, even the more junior ones, will try and prove their value in the same way. And last but not least, in my opinion, is when we talk about toxic culture. So when you work in a team or in a company where the way you're measured or between your colleagues too is by just one-upping each other, just showing, know one more thing. I know I can add one more thing. What you will find is this plethora of things in your PRs, in your implementation, that you really don't need. And again, none of this is technical practice. This is very, very common practice. Another example, and this is more architectural. So I call it the kind of monolith constellation. So this is what happens when you have, a very sensitive service, or let's call it a monolith. It's just multiple definitions for monolith. And what you find is that nobody wants to touch the monolith. Yeah. Nobody wants to touch it because they don't understand it, because the risk is huge, because usually in time you don't have any tests, and the risk of using it is very, very high. So what is the risk here? The risk is, first of all, that if you're scared of changing it on a Monday morning in a regular sprint, I want to know what you're going to do on Saturday night when it breaks in production. How are you going to manage that? And it's unbelievable how many companies just dismiss this. This is just a reality of our business. Yeah. Most companies will have a monolith for services that are used as black box. So what do? People start coding around it and build a constellation. So that's a star, and then you start building all services around it, and you use the service or the monolith as a black box. You understand what goes in, you understand what goes out, and then you build around it. Yeah. So not only you have a big ticking time bomb risk in your service, what you have is massive complexity radiating around your service because you're just building outside and you have no idea. So changing features is more expensive, more risky. Blast radius is gigantic, and it just grows, and your risk grows and grows. So why does this happen is the question, right? Who is designing for that, right? Nobody designs for that. You end up in that situation because usually there's not enough investment in the cost of not doing something. So many people would say we need some time to refactor this, or maybe there's just other priorities. The reality of it is that when people don't have the time to do it officially, they won't do it, especially in these circumstances where there's a big risk factor on the individual. So if the entire company doesn't invest and shows that they want to take the risk and time to do that, the single individual, even one very diligent that would like to fix things, will not, because they think they're going to put their own career in jeopardy. So you will find no small improvement and no big improvement, and this is just a risk that sits there and that people ignore.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so these are other examples of things that are definitely not practice that build up. And clearly I have more. You tell me if you want to hear more, or want to talk about it further.
It's so interesting that all of this, the source is not the technical stuff, but the people stuff or the organization stuff. So, but how can we deal with that? How can we heal that? Because I know a lot of my clients, they are now, when they're now listening to that, they have tears in their eyes, and that's my situation every day. So how can we put it in a better way?
To me, usually there are. So I talk about the concept of holistic engineering, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about it. First, I would like you to reflect on what are the preconditions to even start thinking of a different way of technology. So usually what you find is that people within projects, within companies, will close their eyes towards anything that is not purely tech. And I say people behave like the three monkeys, I don't see, I don't hear, I don't speak. So usually you're an architect, you're an engineering leader, you are aware of issues between people, you're aware of issues in the product department, your issues in HR department, you're aware of issues that you don't put down on paper in your technical factors. The reality is that you close your eyes to those things because you feel that those are petty, human, not scientific. And the actual fact is that those are the variables that have a direct impact on your code. So the first thing I'd like to encourage people to do is to accept that there are other variables in the system that are not just the ones that you control, and that ignoring them is not going to solve the problem. You might not be able to change all of them. You might be able to change some of them, but you can definitely mitigate for all of them, because those are the factors that push your project, after a deadline or so on. So how do I try and address this? I address this with the concept of holistic engineering. For who's not familiar with the concept of holistic is something that you can't quite represent without the single part of the system. And I particularly like the example of holistic medicine. In holistic medicine, you don't cure just the symptoms of the illness, you cure the individual and you go and assess the environment in which the individual lives to understand what are the forces that cause the illness, not just the symptoms of the illness and the medicine for the illness. So if we transport this to engineering and we talk about holistic engineering, we talk about the practice of factoring in all the non-technical factors in your technical decisions so that you can solve for the system and not just for your technical perspective. So how do you do that? What you want to do is to, first of all, surface all the implicit, make them explicit. So all the things in your system that are not quite as explicit as you would like them to be, but that actually you see have an impact, you can start doing that. And then you can start making sure that people around you have also an understanding of these other factors so that it makes it more legitimate for you to actually factor in these things. And then you might want to look at the various dimensions. So I break it down this way. There's external factors and internal factors. And clearly this is simplification. Every system will have more. When you talk about external factors, you have to think of things like tech trends. And that doesn't mean you have to take on all the tech trends. You have to understand what will impact positively and negatively your business in time. It's the same for business trends. If you don't understand where your product is going, you won't know which parts of your system could be changed in a way or another. And it's the same for world events. So many people will factor in, I don't know, Black Friday, Christmas, but how many people are actually factoring elections? How many people are factoring in legislation and how a change in legislation can impact your view of your future? These days, I think a hot topic is digital sovereignty, right? And where are we going in that direction? And these are external. They have an impact. They might have a bigger. These are more like they could have a small impact or they could have a huge impact. So you still have to keep an eye on them. Then you have to talk about internal variables. And usually I break it down in 4. There's the first concept, which is your organization. Then there are product, people, and tech. And I can break down each of them. So first of all, when you think of your organization, I'd like you to think of it as one living system. So it's a system that existed before you joined, and it's a system that will exist after you join. And again, with this, I don't mean to be defeatist. I'm not saying you should accept everything. I'm saying you should understand it so you know how to build on top of it, mitigate what you can change, and change what you can change. But if you don't understand the pre-existing dynamics, the dynamics that are not in your org chart, what is actually the flow of power? What's actually the flow of information? What is the historical reason why culturally one thing is considered negative and the other one thing is considered positive? All the things that I mentioned before, like your career framework, all the systems that are very hard to change in your position very often, you're going to have to deal with it and mitigate with. So if you don't think that you are trying to impact a living system, you're going to struggle more to get done what you want to get done because you're not starting from scratch. You're starting from a living organism. So then you have the triad. So your people, your tech, and your product. So when we talk about product, people usually say, of course, when I say I have to understand my product. Yes, but I would challenge to say that how many people actually understand the 5-year strategy of the company and where we're going? How many people actually understand or have the chance of understanding, right? So this is not a blame game. Have a chance of understanding which parts of your product as a business are going to stay the same forever because that's kind of the trademark of the kind of product it is. For example, I used to work in health tech, and there are some biological functions that do not change. So those things stay the same. There are other things like how the product presents it, services that you can provide on top, those change. Understanding the difference between the things that will never change and the things that might change with different offering, it's very important to understand how to invest in different parts of your system. And also never underestimate the power of marketing campaigns and how that can have an impact on how priorities are changed for the long being of your project. The other aspect is people. And again, it's not the usual how many Java devs I have, how many senior devs I have. It's more, do you actually understand, at least for your key players in your project, what's going on in their life and how that is going to impact your project. Do you know if what you're doing is aligned with your actual career trajectory, or you think that it's aligned with the career trajectory? Do you know if people are getting divorced, having children, taking care of elderly, moving house, all the big life events that actually change the way people can contribute at that point in time in the team, potentially? Do you know if people, broken up? Do you know if people could not work together? Like, do you understand the things that are not meant to be the professional conversations that actually, if people want to share that with you clearly, right, in a polite and appropriate manner, how that is going to impact people, and how you can have mitigations to help and support people through that journey, but you have to have mitigations. You just can't pretend that people are interchangeable and that their life is not going to have an impact on what you do. You're going to have to support them, mitigate, and do everything that is needed to manage your people in the same way that you would manage mitigations of risk in your software. And then we have tech. Of course, for tech, we could talk about 20 million techniques and 20 million things. Within the context of this topic, I feel that I want to bring attention to how many people actually understand how what you're doing is aligned with your technical strategy. Do you even have a technical strategy? Like, is this a step towards it? Like, does that make sense? We always have to do trade-offs, but do we know if the direction of travel is the right one? And also things like, do you actually understand the impact of security and privacy in your system? Are you factoring this early? Do you know that these things could completely stop your project and you could have the best project ever and not have factored in? Another thing that I think people also tend to undervalue is understanding your starting point. So do you really know what's the quality of your service, especially as an architect? You look at your system and you think, this service should be like this, I should change that. But actually, do you really understand the cost of the delta of lower level concerns that might really change the estimate for a kind of project and might make you change something different? And last but not least, to me, it's very important is, do you know if your architecture, your product, and your teams are aligned? Yeah. Because if you have such a tough technical, constraint that your teams do not match, the domain and the architecture, you have some blockages in flow and risks that are really outside of your control at that point in time when you're making a decision, and might really influence whether something can be done now or not, or whether you have to change things before you can do that. So there are many aspects from a system perspective that one has to take on to make decisions that are more reliable. Our business decisions are not very reliable. No project is delivered on time. It's quite peculiar for a business, and I believe that it's part of why we are not considering all the variables of the system. It doesn't mean that it will be an exact science, but it also means that maybe we could be more similar to some other engineering disciplines, factoring in maybe more factors and understanding that people make software, and therefore we have to consider all the human aspects of our decision in tech from the perspective of a technologist that has done tech all their life.
Yeah, that's so great, because when I work with software testers and also, they are always very critical about the product and the software. And often I tell them, you have to take the big picture with the organization and the people. And they often say to me, that's not my job. But now you gave the argument why it's important to do to look at these points too, to make good software. So it's
I think it's everybody's job. It's every technologist's job, and probably even more from the perspective of a software tester. Yeah. Because you really need to understand the system to be able to understand where there might be some gaps, or help your team, or help the perspective of your team. I think the more senior you are, the more you need to have this perspective. But generally, the point is, I think, in giving value and rewarding good behavior, generally for people who approach things with more breadth.
Yeah.
Well, we tend to reward people a lot on depth, which is really valuable. The seniority comes from breadth. Yeah. It's from understanding how your system will be impacted by your change, not only how good this is in an isolated context. And I think that's particularly true for testers, but for all engineers.
Yeah, that's true. Vanessa, thank you very much for these insights. It was very intense, compact view on this, but it's so important for us in the software engineering part. So
it was my pleasure.
I appreciate that you were here in the show, and I wish you all the best for your speech today. Good audience with a lot of questions for you, and enjoy the conference. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks to you. It was a pleasure. Thank you. Goodbye.